This is the audio lecture for Chapter 3 from the Nye text. And the question that Nye is asking this week in the title to our chapter is technology predictable? And just as last week, he doesn't come right out and say what he thinks the answer to that question is, but if you read between the lines, you can get a pretty good sense of how he feels about this question of the predictability of technology. And so just like last week, when the concept at the center of everything we were doing was technological determinism, this week the concept that is at the center of everything that we're doing is this idea of prediction, of being able to predict what is going to happen in terms of technology and be able to predict what sorts of technology are going to emerge or appear and be successful. And within this larger idea or larger concept of prediction, there are a couple different pairs of terms that Nye makes some distinctions between. That are important distinctions that underlie everything else that he discusses in the chapter. And the first of these is the distinction between invention and innovation. These are two terms that we might have ideas about in sort of everyday life, but Nye makes a very important distinction between the two. Basically, that is that invention involves the creation of entirely new technologies, whereas innovation involves making improvements or modifications of some kind to existing technologies. And so this distinction between invention and innovation and the just the semantic difference or the difference in the meanings of those two words as Nye is using them is very important for you to grasp and to understand. And then he utilizes a pair of terms called prediction and forecasting, again, which in just our everyday usage might seem somewhat synonymous or very similar at least to one another, but Nye utilizes them in a very particular way in terms of making a distinction between the two and also in connecting these two terms, prediction and forecasting, with the previous pair of terms, invention and innovation. You'll see a chart, or you will see a chart at the very beginning of the chapter that sort of lays out the relationships amongst these two pairs of terms. The way that Nye talks about it, prediction is over the long term, dealing with a time frame of the long term, and is used in connection with the concept of invention. Whereas forecasting deals with a time frame of up to 10 years and is used in connection with the concept of innovation. So in other words, inventions are sort of more long-term types of things for which prediction is utilized. Innovation is not quite as long-term. They're dealing with technologies that already exist, and so forecasting in the way that Nye is talking about it is something that takes place on a slightly shorter time frame. There's another thing that he talks about, a third one that goes with prediction and forecasting, called projection, and that is even more of a short term, a year or two into the future. And that's used mainly by businesses to project financial performance and so forth. And as Nye says in the text, that third term, projection, that's in the chart, along with prediction and forecasting, is one that we are not really going to worry about, and which Nye himself does not really discuss in too much depth, and certainly not in the same kind of depth with which he talks about prediction and forecasting in chapter 3. So as I've been discussing, inventions are predicted and innovations are forecasted. And so that is the relationship amongst those four terms and sort of the ways in which they're matched up with one another that you should keep in mind and understand as you're both reading chapter 3 and then doing the other activities connected with chapter 3. One of the things that Nye does in chapter 3 in relation to both predictions and forecasts is that he returns to one of the ideas that he discussed at some great length in chapter 1, and that is the whole idea or connections between technology and narrative. He talks about how technological predictions and forecasts are little narratives about the future. And if you think about it a little bit, you probably would be able to figure out how a prediction or a forecast of technology has narrative elements in it. One of the things that we talked about in relation to technology and narrative is how in the use of tools or the use of technology, there are often a variety of possible endings to the little narrative of tool use. And so with predictions or forecasts related to technology, there can be a variety of different endings as well. And predictions and forecasts both deal with different ways in which the story might end. We've got the story of a technology, and then forecasts about innovations related to that technology will add new chapters in terms of alterations to the technology and just changes in the story that surrounds that particular technology. One of the other concepts that Nye discusses in chapter 3 is what is called path dependency. Path dependency. And path dependency he discusses in terms of the phenomenon that sometimes occurs in which certain companies or certain areas of different tech industries end up not being able to see ahead very well in terms of what sorts of technological developments are on the horizon. A lack of foresight in industries which have established technologies and established products, and in which they are dependent on the particular path that they have already been committed to in terms of the products that they have previously developed, in terms of the changes that they anticipate occurring in those products and in those particular forms of technology. And so oftentimes the biggest innovations or new inventions in an area of technology will come from outside of the established companies or the established powers in a particular area of technology, because the existing ones are sort of too blinded by their own previous success and dependent on the path that they have followed in the past. The chief example that Nye gives of this in chapter 3 is that of the company IBM, which you probably are familiar with or have heard of. IBM, the letters stand for International Business Machines, and they, for many, many decades, were and are still makers and manufacturers of office equipment of various kinds. In the late 1970s, when the personal computer, the desktop PC that we know so well today, was first appearing, IBM had a path that they had followed up to that point, in which they had been committed to mainframe computers, which are very large computers that basically filled a whole room and which had a particular type of computing that was done on them. And IBM was blinded a little bit to the idea or the potential in the personal computer. This is an image here of what a mainframe computer looks like. And all of the equipment that you see in this image are parts of the mainframe computer. You can see in the right center of the image a little monitor screen and a keyboard below that. That portion there sort of resembles the early personal computer, but all of the rest of the equipment here that's pictured is also part of the mainframe computer. The large portions sort of back in the corner, the banks of computer machinery along the wall, in which you can see reel-to-reel spindles on which reels of magnetic tape would have been put onto for recording purposes, similar to what we have used in terms of floppy disks and flash drives. Those reels of magnetic tape put on the reel-to-reel machine were how they recorded things on the mainframe computers, recorded data on the mainframe computers. So this is the kind of computer, these very large mainframe computers used for industry, used in educational settings and governmental settings. This is the path that IBM was dependent upon in the decades prior to and leading up to the 1970s and through the 1970s. And so when something like this, the desktop personal computer, appeared, IBM was not very well equipped to deal with it and not very well equipped to compete with it at first. The personal computer that you see here is, of course, the Apple II computer, which was one of the first desktop personal computers and was one of the first products of the Apple company that we now know, of course, from iPhone and iPod and iPad fame. And so this is an example of the path dependency that Nye talks about in Chapter 3. One of the other things that Nye talks about is the importance of consumer demand. How demand for a particular technology by consumers factors into the development of new technologies. Oftentimes, a technology is developed, but if there's no consumer demand for that product, or consumers do not sort of adopt that product or show interest in that product, then the particular technology is likely to fail or likely to not be met with success. And the example that Nye gives here is that of a technology called picture phone in the 1960s. Now, picture phone was a product and a technology developed by AT&T, which back in the 1960s and through most of the 20th century was one of the biggest, most powerful companies in America and had a monopoly on the telephone system. Every aspect of utilizing a telephone was controlled by AT&T as the only company that was allowed to have long-distance service, the only company that was allowed to have local telephone service, and every aspect of using a telephone in these decades was controlled by AT&T. And they came up in the 1960s with this technology called the picture phone that they debuted at the 1964 World's Fair. And it looked a little something like this. It was a regular telephone that you can see on the table here with a handset that the woman has up to her ear. But it also then had a video terminal with a screen and a small camera on it that was connected to the telephone. And so anytime that you used the telephone, you would also see the person that you were talking to on the other end of the line, and you were be able to be seen by the person you were talking to. So basically adding the visual image to the speaking or to the audio that you normally hear when you are talking on the telephone. This was not a success, as Nye discusses briefly. This technology did not catch on and in fact ended up being one of the big failures of 1960s technology. And there's a lot of reasons why we can speculate as to why that would have been. One is that it was very expensive to add picture phone technology to your regular telephone, but the other is that there just was not consumer demand for this technology. There was not a lot of people who were wishing for or clamoring for having visual contact along with the audio contact you have when you are talking on the telephone. And so this is an example that Nye discusses in the text of how consumer demand factors into the success or, as in the case of picture phone, the failure of particular technologies. In one portion of chapter 3, sort of about the middle of the chapter, Nye discusses a few key inventions and talks about them in the context of some of the ideas that he is discussing in the chapter. And these are the key inventions that he mentions: the telegraph, the telephone, the phonograph, and the personal computer. And for those of you that do not know a lot about the historical context of these inventions, I just wanted to give a little glimpse here, or a little bit of information about the history of these key inventions so that you have that in your background or in your understanding when you do read the chapter and encounter the references that Nye makes to these technologies. Now, the telegraph is probably the one of the four technologies that you possibly have never heard of before, or if you have heard of it, maybe do not have a very good idea of what exactly it was. The telegraph was the first technology ever that allowed for instantaneous long-distance communication. Before the telegraph was invented, which happened in the 1840s, there was no way to communicate over long distances. You could write a letter or type a letter and send it through the post office or send it via messenger, but the amount of time that it took for that message to get from you to whoever you were sending it to was simply whatever the amount of time was for a horse or wagon to travel from where you were to where the other person was. And that was the only form of long-distance communication that existed. The telegraph changed that by allowing long-distance communication between telegraph operators. The little object that you see pictured on the left here is a telegraph key called a telegraph key, and the little knob on the upper left there was sort of bounced up and down so that the metal rod came into contact with the metal piece underneath it there, and it created little pulses of electricity that traveled over the wire, and messages were sent in the form of Morse code. You probably have heard of Morse code before, dots and dashes, created by the electrical pulses of the telegraph key. On the other end of the wire from where the message was being sent from, the receiving end of the wire, the telegraph operator would decode that into words and sentences, and those would be typed up onto a sheet of paper, as you see here on the right, in the form of a telegram, and that would be, a sheet of paper in the form of a message that the recipient would pick up and read, much as a regular letter. And so the telegraph or telegraphy was the first form of long-distance communication that was instantaneous, meaning that whatever the distance was between the sender and the receiver received the message almost immediately after the sender sent it out. The next key invention is the telephone, and it was invented in the 1870s and became widespread use in about 1900, or in the years immediately following 1900. This was the first type of communication in which people could talk to each other simultaneously over long distances, as well as locally and generally in the same city. And you can see here a couple of different types of telephones from the early years, in which the earpiece and the mouthpiece were separated from one another, and you had to hold the earpiece up to your ear while talking into the mouthpiece. The phonograph was invented or first emerged as a technology at about the same time as the telephone, in the decade of the 1870s, the late 1870s. This was the first technology that existed for recording sound, for taking sounds and fixing them in a more or less permanent form that could be played back at a later time. And this first took the form of cylinder records, which is what the machine shown here on the left was for. It came in a little cylinder that slid on there, and then the record needle or the phonograph needle read the sound from the grooves in the cylinder. Later on, cylinders were replaced by flat vinyl discs of the kind that we know today still in some areas as records on record players, and the machine you see on the right is one of those disc record players. And in both cases here, before there existed technology for amplification of sound, in both of these images, the phonographs just have this little horn that is sticking up, and through which the sound was amplified slightly, although it was still ended up being pretty soft. And these horns amplified the sound in the same way that a megaphone would amplify your voice if you spoke into it, just taking that sound and sort of projecting it. And so the phonograph was first emerged as an invention in the late 1870s, and by the 1890s was a fairly commonplace piece of equipment in people's homes. And the last of these four key inventions that Nye discusses is the personal computer, which I've already said a few words about. The desktop version of the computer, which had previously been found mainly in these very large mainframe forms, emerged in the late 1970s, early 1980s, desktop personal computers. And on the left here we see the same image of the Apple II computer from the previous slide. And the image on the right is actually of one of the IBM personal computers. By the early 1980s, IBM, despite its previous path dependency on mainframe computers, had managed to develop its own personal computer, which entered the market and was successful to a great extent simply because IBM was such a large company and was able to sort of force itself into the personal computer market after many other companies, such as Apple, had already sort of pioneered it and been successful in it. So there's just a few additional concepts or ideas related to technology and prediction that I want to wrap up with. And these are sort of a discussion that Nye does in terms of the things that don't always win out in technology that you might suspect or predict would win out. And one of them is that the technology that is designed the best does not always win out. The best designed technology is not always that is most successful. It's also not necessarily the one that is the best technologically or the most advanced technologically, or does, most sophisticated technically, does not always win out. This was the case with VHS videotapes versus beta videotapes, which Nye discusses briefly in the chapter. Beta videotapes were a more advanced and sophisticated technology in many respects than VHS videotapes, but because of a variety of things related to the way that these technologies for videotape emerged, VHS ended up being the dominant format in terms of video tapes and video recording. Convenience does not always win out either. The technology or product that is the most convenient is not always the one that is most successful. And then finally, the expected uses of a technology do not always win out. The expected uses of a technology are not always those that are actually those practiced by the consumer. Oftentimes, consumers will come up with their own uses for a product. This is especially the case with the computer, with the personal computer. Many of the uses that the original inventors of the personal computer envisioned were supplemented or replaced by other uses that users of the personal computer sort of came up with on their own or added to the expected uses. So these are a few of the ways in which maybe is not always all that predictable in terms of predicting technology, in which technology is unpredictable. And that is sort of one of the points with which Nye ends the chapter, that in the end, maybe technology is not actually all that predictable.